Got dreams of being a professional podcaster, but have no idea what you're doing?
This is impossible.
That's about to change.
A new kind of school.
Welcome to the Pod School Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the show. Today I'm going to be talking podcast logos. Everybody always says, don't judge a book by its cover. But I guarantee if you're anything like me, you've judged more than just books by their cover. That's how I buy wine because I have absolutely no wine skills. I just look at the label and go, oh, that looks pretty. I'm sure it's drinkable. And we do this with a lot of things. And your podcast artwork is like the wine label on your wine. It is the book cover on your book. It is the first thing that people will see that makes them think, do I want to listen to this? That might sound a little counterintuitive because people are making visual decisions about an audio medium, but we are fickle creatures and it does impact us. So you want something that stands out, particularly if you are starting your show now when there are hundreds of thousands of shows out there. We are no longer in the early days of podcasting when there weren't that many shows around. Now, every Tom, Dick and Harry is jumping on this bandwagon. So you need to make sure that your show stands out from others in the iTunes store when people are walking through your category and looking for shows to try. So here are some tips when you're thinking about how to do your podcast logo. The first is, if you have got a category, say if you're doing a business podcast or an arts podcast or a science podcast, I would advise going into that category on iTunes and searching through the shows that already exist. You want to stand out from the shows that are already in the iTunes library. So go through and see what's there and then maybe pick a color or an image that stands out and makes things different. If you are in a category where every man and his dog has got a photo of themselves on their podcast logo, maybe you want to run with a cartoon image or a different standout image that's going to make you look different from the rest. Start your process by looking at what is already out there and then start to think, right, how could I differentiate myself in this space? The other thing you want to be mindful of is text. There are some podcast logos that you look at and you think, you really designed that on a giant screen, not thinking that most people will be looking at this on a tiny phone. Most people look at your podcast image on their mobile phone, and that is an image shrunk down quite considerably. If you've got half your life story on your podcast logo, it's going to be very difficult for anybody to read what that is. The simpler, the better when it comes to text. You want to be able to see the image of your podcast quite small and still pick out what it's about. See the words, see the name, see the title. So the more uncluttered and simple you can keep that, the better. You can go into all kinds of detail on your website or in the description of your podcast. But when it comes to that podcast logo, that little square image that people are going to see, just put the bare essentials so I can get a sense of exactly what your show is from the name or the picture, and that's it. And that's also important when you're thinking about the image. Don't make it too busy. If it's really small and you've got this really intricate sort of cartoon drawing with 750,000 tiny little things, that might look great blown up when you're looking at it on your computer. But when I'm actually looking at it, it might just look like a whole bunch of smudgy colors together and I'm going to lose all of the detail at that size. So try and go as simple as possible and tell me something about your show in the image. It could be just a photo of you. If you are the expert and you are sharing your expertise, then maybe a photo of you and your show name is all that you need. But maybe there is a really simple image that you can use. If your show is about male grooming, just to pull something out of my butt, then maybe your podcast logo is just a cartoon mustache and that's it. Or maybe just the cartoon mustache and the name of your show. Simple is always better, but it is really nice to get a sense, if you can, from that image and the text of what your show is about, because you don't have a huge amount of other information when you're scrolling through things like the iTunes store. It's usually just the podcast logo and the name of the show. So just be mindful of how little information people have, so how much you have to pack in to get people to click on your image. Remember that if you create a podcast logo and you kick off your show, that doesn't need to be the logo that you go with forever. You can refresh it and update it later on. So don't get too bogged down in this and get stuck in paralysis by analysis and think, oh, well, I just won't bother doing a show if I can't get this image right. You can get lost in your own head with this stuff, so don't let it bog you down too much, but just try and keep it as simple as possible and try and convey as much information as you can with that image. The iTunes specs, which I'll pop onto the show notes page, which you can find at podschoolpodcast.com, just type logo into the search bar, are 1400 by 1400 pixels to 3000 by 3000 pixels. If you just make it the biggest version, then iTunes or whatever the app is will adjust that image according to wherever your image is being seen, whether it's an iPad or an iPhone or an Android or wherever it is. And you can create these images yourself. I have created show images in the past myself using Canva, which is a great free tool. You can also use PicMonkey, which a lot of people are doing some cool things with, or you can hire a designer. You could head to a website like Fiverr or Upwork, where there are a lot of freelancers that are shopping their wares, and you can get some really cheap work done there. Just try and be as clear as possible in your brief when you're using one of those services, because sometimes they'll charge by the hour and you don't want to be going back and forth 150,000 times. That's why I actually like to use Canva, because I don't want to pay somebody every time I want to change the font. And sometimes I will drum up as close to an idea of what I want in Canva as possible. And you don't need a great deal of design skills. Believe me, this is very, very easy program to use if you haven't used it already. But I get as much of the idea of what I want as possible before I give it to a designer, so that rather than trying to explain it in words, they can kind of see where I'm getting at. So even if you don't use Canva to create the logo that you end up using, it can be a great way to create something to give to a designer so that they've got a very clear indication of exactly what you want. The other thing it's always nice to do too, if you've already got a website, is to try and tie some of the colors or the themes or the fonts in with your website or any other collateral that you have, so that you start to build a coherent brand, so that everything starts to have a similar look and feel. That can help you as you build things going forward. But again, that's a small detail that maybe when you're starting out you don't necessarily need to think about. You just want to create a cover art or podcast logo that really pops. So look at what's out there in the iTunes library and see if you can pick a color or an image that's really going to stand out. You want to convey as much as possible about what the show is about using your image and your text, but you want to keep it simple. So don't clutter it up with heaps of information or heaps of text. Just one or two words or just the show name, so that it doesn't clutter up the image, so that if I'm looking at it on an iPhone, I'm not looking at it going, that is just a whole bunch of word vomit in a little square. I hope that's helped you think about how to create your podcast logo. Of course, if you have any questions that you would like answered on the show, you can always email me. You'll find my contact page at podschoolpodcast.com. As well, there is information there about my online podcasting course if you need a little bit more assistance in getting your show out of your head and into people's ears. I'll see you next week, and until then, happy podcasting.
That's all for today.